Well, welcome to everybody on this call. I'm so pleased to be able to connect with all of you, even if that connection has to occur electronically. This is an especially good time, I think, for all of us to think about connections. Ramadan begins on April 22nd, a week from next Wednesday. Easter this Sunday, April 12th. Passover began last night. And even if you don't celebrate any of those holidays, I hope we are all looking forward, hopefully, to the rebirth that this season of the year brings to all of us. My name's John Gordon. I'm Executive Director of the ACLU of Minnesota. And here at the ACLU of Minnesota, I wouldn't say we're experiencing a rebirth, but we are alive and well, and we are consumed with all of the issues that we fight for every day. And those fights are continuing, and we are in full battle mode. It's not surprising that fear and uncertainty that everybody is experiencing, those factors don't make this fight any easier. But we are all over it. We are fighting to keep people out of jails and prisons where their health cannot be protected. We want to be sure that a prison sentence doesn't become a death sentence. And we are worried about both immigration enforcement and incarceration and state and federal criminal law enforcement. We are fighting to preserve our democracy, as Julia Decker and Munir Mohammed, our legislative team, are scrambling to get into the smoke-filled back rooms, now that are the virtual smoke-filled back rooms of our legislature, so that you as citizens are not locked out of the rooms where it happens. And it is happening in St. Paul, and it's happening in government all over this state. We have been advocating the governor and the Commissioner of Corrections and prosecutors and law enforcement to minimize the number of people who end up detained and incarcerated, which is always a problem, but even more so now when it is so unsafe. Finally, we're continuing to work with our colleagues at the National ACLU and other affiliates all over this country. And I'm proud to let you know that as of yesterday, there were more than 9,000 people who have been released from incarceration because of COVID-related advocacy by the ACLU, meaning likely 9,000 lives saved through our efforts and your support. So we are on the front lines of the battle against the cynical use of the COVID pandemic to restrict availability of abortion services. Who would have thought that was coming down the pike with this? But especially in states like Ohio, Iowa, Alabama, to name only a few, some folks see this as a great opportunity to exercise more control over the health care that women have available to them. And we are fighting so that women can continue to be in control of their own health care. Then, of course, there's the inevitable use of this crisis to ramp up the use of surveillance technologies to get personal information about people, often using well-founded concerns of law enforcement and emergency medical care providers to allow the government not only to collect and maintain personal information, but potentially to load it into databases that powerful people, both inside and outside the government, can use as they see fit. We cannot, and we will not allow that to happen. We very much have our eye on the notion that this will end at some point, and we need to be alert to what kinds of information we have collected and what kinds of systems we've created and how they are going to be used on an ongoing basis. And of course, emergency powers are also a concern in these days, and we have been in close touch here in Minnesota in particular to assure that the use of those powers is carefully tailored and controlled so that we do not permanently lose our rights and our freedoms because of a temporary, we hope, temporary problem. And so that's another thing that we've got our eye on here, and we are working hard on that issue. So here's what we're going to do tonight. We are going to hear from our legal and policy director. We are going to have our moderator, Jana Kooren, ask questions. Some of those questions have been submitted ahead of time, and we've reviewed and selected questions that have come in. But I also encourage all of you to submit additional questions via the chat function in your Zoom program. And we may not get to all of them, but we will get to as many of those as we possibly can, we promise, because we want to be alert to your concerns and not just lecturing at you, but responsive to the concerns that all of you have got. And they are, I know, the concerns that all of us have got in these times. So now I'd like to pass this off to Teresa Nelson. Terry is our excellent legal director here at the ACLU of Minnesota. She heads an outstanding team of lawyers and paraprofessionals who are working hard in the courts and in advocacy on behalf of individuals and on people in general. And Terry is now going to take over for the next part of this presentation. Terry.
Thank you, John. And that was a great intro. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that we have done and what we're watching for, and then also things that we are concerned about. So a lot of the work that we've done in the last few weeks has been focused on people who are in detention, either who are in prison or jail or who are in immigration detention. And the reason we're focusing on that is that people in prisons and jails are in crowded conditions. They've got nowhere to escape. Social distancing is virtually impossible. A lot of times facilities have people in dormitory style cells with multiple people. And we know that once the virus enters a facility, it is likely to spread like wildfire. And so we need to protect people who are locked up, people who are in correctional facilities and jails. But we also need to protect the workers. They are also being exposed to the virus if it enters the facility, and they're coming, when they go come home from work, they're in the community. And so this keeping people in jails safe and healthy is a community concern, because if the prisons and jails aren't healthy, then the communities surrounding those prisons and jails aren't healthy. We also know that people in prison are going to be leaving their facilities, they're going to be coming home. People get released almost every day. And so we need to do as much as we can to keep people healthy in those facilities. So we've sent letters, we've joined coalitions, we've made public calls to the governor, to the attorney general, to judges, to sheriffs, to county attorneys, legislators, and others, asking them all to do what they can to reduce jail and prison populations and to have concrete plans to keep people safe. So for example, we sent a letter to the chief judge of the 6th Judicial District up in the Duluth area, asking for the judge to order the release of 61 people who are in a correctional facility. The purpose of their being there is to receive drug treatment. The facility can't provide that treatment right now because they are understaffed because of COVID concerns. And so there is really no reason to keep these folks in. They've got very short-term sentences. We've asked that they be released. We have seen some releases around the state, but we need to do more, and we're running out of time. In ICE facilities, it's the same problem. But even worse is that people are being brought into ICE detention every day. And so whereas a local jail, the police can maybe limit the number of people that are booked into jail, in an ICE facility, they're coming in every day. And so the threat is there every day that somebody is going to get booked into that facility who's maybe asymptomatic, but who has the virus and could spread it. So we've urged ICE to release immigrants from administrative detention. We've urged them to halt arrests and their requests to local jails for holds, and overall stop ICE enforcement at this point. We've also filed a case on behalf of an immunocompromised woman who is in ICE custody here in Minnesota, and seeking to get her immediate release. The bottom line is that being in jail, prison, or detention should not mean a death sentence. And so we need to do a lot more here in Minnesota to get people released. Some of the things that we're watching for, John mentioned the stay-at-home order and enforcement, and we are very concerned about how police are going to enforce the stay-at-home order. We have definite concerns about any police activity that it will follow the same kinds of racial disparities that we see throughout our criminal legal system and in our history. So we urge the governor to make the enforcement as voluntary as possible and only use criminal charges if it's absolutely necessary. And then also we've urged the governor, where it can't be voluntary, that police should issue citations instead of custodial arrest. Because if you think about it, it makes little sense to book somebody into a jail where they cannot social distance in order to enforce an order that is intended to make people practice social distancing. So it completely undermines the purpose of this stay home order. We also think that courts should consider ability to pay when it comes time to deal with citations. We are also hearing concerns, particularly from communities of color, from our immigrant communities, that police are going to use this outbreak as a pretext to arrest people for something else. We know that there are essential employees who are going to and from work every day, and many of them are people who are agricultural workers or people who are in different professions that are dominated by people of color, by immigrants, and police should not use this as an opportunity to simply pull people over to figure out where they're going as a pretext. So I am going to turn it over to Julia, and she can talk about what she's been working on in the legislature.
Thanks, Terry. So everybody, my name is Julia Decker. I am the policy director here at the ACLU of Minnesota. And as some of you may be aware, the state legislature has done a sort of recess. They're technically not in a session until April 14th, but they have already come back a couple different times with the agreement of all the leadership in both the Senate and the House to vote on some COVID response bills. And they can be called back at any time before April 14th as well, but it's on a very sort of ad hoc sort of case-by-case basis. So it's right now pretty unclear how things are moving forward. One of the few concrete things that we do have is that any bill or any proposal relating to anything right now, but of course they've been working specifically on COVID bills, in order for it to even be heard by the House and the Senate, the leadership in both the House and the Senate have to have previously agreed that it will be allowed to be heard. So far, the bills that have been voted on by both the House and the Senate did not go through committees and didn't have public hearings, didn't have public testimony before they reached the whole House and Senate. Some committees this past week started to hold hearings via Zoom, where there is some opportunity for people to be able to testify remotely. Some of them have been what are called informational hearings, where they're informal and no action is actually taken, but some committee hearings there were votes taken. So that is also in flux and is not entirely clear about what that means, what that means in terms of bills that are getting informational hearings. It's very unclear. We're monitoring, all the information that's coming out, any information we can get. We've been watching these sessions remotely. We've been watching these remote committee hearings when they're being held. We've submitted testimony, written testimony generally to the committees that have had remote hearings with issues that we are interested in. So things like corrections, things like policing and surveillance and stuff like that, privacy rights. But it is very difficult because we have even less notice. It's the process is even less transparent than it usually is. So it's been quite sort of a difficult atmosphere to operate in in the policy world. There's been a few COVID response bills. We have not had, major concerns about the stuff that has passed in any of them so far. They've mainly dealt with funding and workers' comp, unemployment, stuff like that. But we are continuing to monitor those as they come out. And we will continue to do so. So that's sort of the brief, I guess, discussion. I think there's, I will turn it back over to Jana to do some questions and answers, and we can get into some additional things in that question and answer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's so great to have you with us. I'm Jana Kooren, and I'm the Community Engagement Director at the ACLU of Minnesota, and I'm going to kind of move to the question and answer period during this time. So some questions have been coming through on the chat. That's great. You can keep sending them to us. I'm going to try to get to as many as possible because I'm also right now asking some questions that were submitted earlier. So we will do our best to get to everyone's questions. Okay, so Terry, I'm going to start off with you. Terry, you mentioned all the letters that we've sent and the case that we filed to get someone of immigrant detention and all the work we're doing to try to reduce the number of people that we are seeing in facilities. So can you talk a little bit about what progress or results we have seen thus far?
Yeah, absolutely. We have seen some significant reductions in jail populations. And I think particularly in Ramsey County, the chief judge there delegated authority to the sheriff to release people depending on their charges or their jail sentence they are serving. And so people were able to be released onto home monitoring, for example, or to finish out their sentence after the emergency is passed. And they were able to cut their jail population by over half. And that means that people won't be double bunked and they will be able to maintain some social separation. Now that response though isn't consistent statewide. And we're concerned that Hennepin County Workhouse, for example, still has a fairly large population as of yesterday. And it's really difficult to get details about what jail populations look like throughout the state. We have 87 counties and almost as many jails. And so it's really difficult to get details about how many of those jails still have people double bunked and one person on top of another. So that is problematic. With regard to the state correctional facilities, we have seen some good, we've had some good dialogue with the Commissioner Schnell. I think that he is working hard to keep people safe. He is working on expanding work release and streamlining the process for vulnerable folks to request conditional medical release, and that we are very hopeful will lead to some reductions and to keeping some of those especially vulnerable people safe in this time. But unfortunately, we're running out of time. Already the virus is in the Moose Lake facility, and we've been hearing some really troubling stories over the past few days from people there who are, well, they're terrified, but they're also saying that things are much worse than what we're hearing in the public. In our habeas petition on behalf of the immunocompromised woman who is in a jail here in Minnesota, we are still waiting for the federal court to rule on that case. We have been monitoring other federal court cases of medically vulnerable people who are seeking release in the criminal context, and the troubling trend here in Minnesota has been to deny those releases even when people are extremely vulnerable, based on the lack of any identified cases in a particular facility. But we know again that people can be asymptomatic and still spread the virus, and we don't have enough details about how many jails are actually testing people. And so unless you're going to test everybody, which they're not doing, once they confirm a case in a facility, it's going to be too late to prevent an outbreak.
Okay, thanks for that. So Julia, we've been getting a lot of questions with people who have concerns about privacy, the use of privacy technology, and all sorts of things, and kind of as it relates to the current pandemic. So what are some of the privacy issues we've been kind of trying to keep an eye on or tracking during this time?
So even prior to the outbreak, privacy rights and protecting, you know, people's right to be free from surveillance was something that we had been working very hard on. We were working on requiring warrants for law enforcement to use drones to surveil people's emails, things like that. You know, there was a discussion that was starting just prior to the beginning of the session around the use of facial recognition technology. So that discussion is being had. So those are just continue to be very much front and center. Those types of issues continue to be very front and center, you know, particularly in a time of crisis. I think the hard part is, you know, it's hard. Many of the surveillance things that we are very concerned about are the type of things that would not have sort of publicity, are not going to have sunlight shown on them unless there's sort of specific provisions for sunlight. And one of the things we saw, and one of the things we've been working on, is that a couple years ago, maybe a year ago or so, there was a law that did get passed in Minnesota that we worked on that said in order for police to track the location of your cell phone, so you know, pinging towers to see where your cell phone's been, they should get a warrant, and they also need to report that you know, how often they use those tracking warrants. It was intended to show you know, to put sunlight on the use of these tracking warrants and how often they were being used. But in practice, those reporting provisions just haven't played out the way that the legislature intended them to. And so we've been working on trying to clarify that, but right now that sunlight still isn't being, you know, is being stymied basically. So a lot of these things are just still happening in the shadows, which is really troubling, and is something that we're continuing to monitor and continuing to be proactive about, because of the potential for such invasive use of those technologies.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Terry, turning it back over to you. You talked a little bit about the stay-at-home order earlier, but I want to dive into it a little bit more, so I have a couple of questions for you about that, and some of them have come in through the chat as well. But first, can you talk a little bit about where does the governor kind of derive this authority, and like, is it unlimited? Can he do whatever he wants? You know, talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So Minnesota law does authorize the governor to declare a peacetime state of emergency. And that statute gives the governor, quote, general direction and control of emergency management. So his authority to act is very broad. For example, he's authorized to make, amend, and rescind orders and rules. He can also promulgate orders and rules that have the full force and effect of law. So we saw him doing that in the stay home order, where he made a violation of the stay home order a misdemeanor, which, you know, there is no misdemeanor on the books for violating the governor's stay home order, but he was able to do that. So his authority is broad, but it's not completely unlimited. The governor's actions still have to comply with the Constitution. So that said, I think a court scrutinizing the governor's actions will look at whether his actions are narrowly tailored to serve compelling government interests. And that's the highest level of scrutiny that a court will typically apply to a government's actions that infringe on constitutional rights. In the current emergency, I think there probably is a compelling interest. And with this unprecedented threat, I think what that means, though, is that his actions have to be directly grounded in science and public health. So the current stay-at-home order clearly is an enormous and almost unprecedented curtailment of our individual civil liberties. But measures like this do have overwhelming support from public health experts as being necessary and to protect our collective well-being. And so I think courts looking at the governor's actions, as long as they are grounded in science and public health, I think, and that they are necessary to protect the public, I think a court is likely to uphold them.
Okay, great. And kind of building on, so let's stay at the stay-at-home for a moment. We've had a couple of questions about enforcement of the stay-at-home order. So earlier, Terry, you had mentioned that police should only use arrests to enforce quarantine when absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. So could you give an example of what it means when that would be absolute necessary and sometimes where it wouldn't?
So I think that I think there's pretty rare circumstances where booking somebody into jail would be absolutely necessary to enforce this order. I think, you know, making it voluntary, educating people and making them understand the reasons for the order and why they're violating it should be adequate in most circumstances. If you have a situation where there is somebody who is repeatedly violating the order after repeated warnings, perhaps somebody who is putting other people at risk, then I think you know, a criminal citation is probably in order. But again, you know, booking somebody into jail for violating the stay-home order really is counterproductive. It goes against the whole point of the order because people can't social distance in that situation.
Okay, great. This is going to stay with you for one more question about the stay-at-home order. Terry, can you explain to us a little bit more about how the stay-at-home order implicate the First Amendment at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we are told to stay at home, you know, participating in demonstrations or other kinds of assemblies that are protected by the First Amendment, participating in religious activities, you know, we are, as John mentioned, we're observing, Jews around the world are observing Passover right now, Easter is coming up, Ramadan is coming up. And people have had to modify their religious practices. They can't have large gatherings of people outside of their household right now. And so that all of those things are curtailed with the stay-home order. And although media are considered essential activities for the stay-home order, they're also challenged in their ability to report because of their access to things like the courts and to the legislature, as Julia mentioned earlier.
Okay, great. Julia, I'm going to pass it back over to you for a little bit. I know people have a lot of questions about the legislature and, you know, what's happening. So as you mentioned before, the Minnesota Legislature is still happening. However, it sounds like they're not being as transparent as typical. So what is the ACLU thinking about what's kind of reasonable to expect at a time like this, as far as being able to access the process?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and this just happened today, there was a picture that circulated basically of a chain and a lock on the front doors of the Capitol building. So just sort of symbolic of the times that we're in. You know, I think broadly speaking, we as we would say open government is really important. It's always important, but it's especially important in a time of crisis. Restrictions based on public health guidance, you know, sort of as Terry is saying, you know, there is going to be curtailment of individual rights. I mean, those may be understandable and necessary. But the way that the legislature is sort of acting right now and essentially legislating behind closed doors without a lot of public input and without outside the public eye, you know, is concerning to us. So just as sort of an example, the very first response bill that the state legislature put forward around, you know, a variety of things, some funding, some policy provisions, was not released to the public until right before representatives hadn't fully looked through the bill, didn't fully know what was in that bill. And so the timing there, both for the public and for sort of rank and file legislators, was troubling. And I think, as I mentioned before, there were also no public committee hearings on that bill. The first anybody had seen of it, you know, or had a chance to talk about it was when it was arrived at the floor already. And in terms of for public health, I think it's also reasonable to insist on some form of, you know, the ability for the public to have input in this process, the ability for the public to observe what their elected representatives are doing and how the process is being carried out.
Okay, thanks. And Julia, sticking with me for a second. Let's look a little farther out. I know a lot of people are concerned. We got some questions leading up to this about November's election. What is the ACLU watching for in regards to the election?
Sure. So we are, as we always do, we're monitoring really closely for any efforts that will restrict voting rights. So for instance, polling place closures that would disproportionately impact certain communities. Minnesota, I think is fortunate. We have a fairly strong system of no excuse absentee balloting. So a lot of people, if they want to vote by mail, already have that option. It's a constitutional guarantee that we have an election, so we're working to make sure that happens. I think, sort of in tandem with what the previous point, it just is going to be a little bit harder to see potential bad things coming down the pipeline because of the way the legislature is operating right now.
And just one last question to round out this section with you. Have you seen any, have there been any bills introduced, at least that we've been able to see so far, that would dramatically curtail like privacy rights or surveillance? So it's a question that just came in from the audience.
Yeah, no major things that we weren't already sort of monitoring prior to the outbreak. I think there's certainly been some discussions about, additional measures that law enforcement or other, the government could try to take, but nothing that has been introduced as far as I can think of at this point in time.
Right, great, thank you. Okay, Terry, coming back to you for a little bit. We have heard about some states, and John had mentioned at the beginning, where the governor is trying to limit access to abortions this time. Have we seen any movement like this here in Minnesota?
We have not, and fortunately the governor in his executive order very specifically called out the ability of women to obtain medically necessary health care. And so we are fortunate that we are not living in a state that has governors who've taken this opportunity to try and restrict women's health care.
Great. So we've had a number of people ask this question. As so many folks may know on the call or not, or this could be news, the ACLU filed a lawsuit last year to try to restore voting rights to people with felony convictions. And a lot of people are wondering about the status of that lawsuit and if it is still advancing or what is happening with it right now.
Yeah, the lawsuit is still going forward. We just finished filing briefs on motions for summary judgment, which is a motion asking the court to rule on the legal issues and to grant our request for an order to allow the more than 50,000 people living in Minnesota with a felony conviction the ability to vote in November. We are waiting for the court to rule on whether or not to go forward with a hearing that is set to take place on Friday the 17th. And we're hopeful that the court will either order a telephonic hearing or will decide our summary judgment motions on the briefs instead. So we're still waiting on that. There is a possibility that the court would stay the case. We are hopeful that that does not happen.
Okay, and we're going to go back to the stay at home. We have a lot of questions talking about arrests and police approaching people. So first of all, we have a question: is being out of your house enough for a Terry stop in the state, considering we have a shelter-in-place order in right now?
I would say it is not enough. And while we are worried that police are going to use this as a pretext, the law is not on their side. The stay-at-home order has a number of exemptions, including seeking medical care, getting groceries, recreation, driving for pleasure, biking for pleasure. So there are, and walking and getting other exercise. There are all kinds of different exemptions from the stay-home order. So simply seeing somebody out in the community, even if they're in a large group, is not enough for the police to think that they're violating the stay home order. It could be a large extended family that lives together, that are in the same household. And so, no, police should not simply use the fact that somebody is out in the community as a basis to investigate them.
Okay, and kind of sticking with kind of arrest and focusing in on people, there is kind of two parts to this question based on what people are asking. Is so, what have we heard about how police are responding when people are either calling in on the tip line the governor launched, or other ways, reporting groups of people playing, you know, or seeing groups of folks together? And so are we kind of monitoring that? What do we think about this? And then specifically diving in more, is that, do we have a plan to track any racial disparities in any of these arrests? And kind of charging decisions as people are being arrested for the stay-at-home order.
Yeah, so we, like I said, we are concerned about how police respond. And we know from some of the data that we collected in Minneapolis that a lot of racial disparities come out of 911 calls and people calling to report young men of color hanging around in an alley as being suspicious. And so the same concerns translate in this stay home order, that people are, because of implicit bias or explicit bias, are going to call police and report people of color who are out and about. And so we want to make sure that police don't enforce this disproportionately. And part of that is in making sure that we make enforcement voluntary, right? So if police hear about somebody who's possibly violating the stay home order and they go and talk to the individual and explain to them why they should go home, that person doesn't end up with a criminal record. What we have been seeing so far and in citations is that it seems like enforcement varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, first of all, but we've also seen police using this to pile on charges. So we've seen examples where somebody was pulled over for DWI and they are also facing a charge of violating the stay home order. And that seems really mean-spirited to us. That is, police should be dealing with those underlying criminal conducts and not simply using this to add one more charge to an individual. We know that misdemeanor records can follow somebody throughout their life and can have deleterious effects on their ability to get housing and their ability to get jobs. And so we don't want unnecessary criminal charges for people. We don't have the resources right now to systematically track every department that is issuing stay home orders, issuing citations, but that is something that is on the horizon that we will be looking at in the future, because as this progresses, we are definitely concerned that it's going to affect people of color disproportionately.
Yeah, kind of sticking with this effect disproportionately, we had some questions come in about what are things that people can do to kind of stop COVID-related discrimination in our communities in Minnesota, right? So not only looking at people who are calling the police more likely on Black folks, immigrants, whoever, but also in the fact that we've seen a huge rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans all over the country.
Yeah, and I think there's two different things that we as members of the public need to watch out for. And one is making sure that our government is not discriminating when it comes to either enforcement of various executive orders, or when it comes to distributing government aid or any other government actions with respect to this emergency. So government needs to treat people equally, and we need to make sure that we are telling our elected officials and our city council members and our police departments that we expect them to treat people equally. When it comes to private acts of discrimination, which are unfortunately, we're seeing an uptick of that. There are some avenues that people can go to. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights, for example, will investigate claims of discrimination in places of public accommodation, in employment, in housing, all of those things. And so if it's within their jurisdiction, people should file complaints. But every member of the community has a responsibility to speak up if we see this happening. It is completely unacceptable to treat anybody differently because of their national origin, because of the color of their skin, because of the perception that somehow this is a virus that is coming from Asian Americans, because it's not. And so we need to speak out. Just like we need to speak out on every other incident of discrimination.
Okay. So another question that came in is, how do you advocate, or how are you advocating for which people should be released from prison, considering they're in there for committing sometimes serious crimes?
Mm-hmm. So I think that there are different types of advocacy depending on the facility. For people who are in pretrial detention, who are charged with crimes and awaiting their trial, many of them are sitting in jail on bail that is $78. They cannot afford $78 or $100 bail. We should not be holding people in jail simply because they cannot afford the bail that has been set for them. And there is certainly an issue of public safety to look at, but we also need to calculate in the public safety harms that happen when we have too many people in the jail right now. And there are harms both to the people who are inside and the people who are in the community as well. In the prison system, there are many people who are very close to their release date and who are vulnerable, medically vulnerable. Other states have laws that are pretty expansive that allow the Commissioner of Corrections to change the place of confinement, or to commute a person's sentence, or grant compassionate release for individuals. And Minnesota's laws are narrower, but I think that there is some ability for the commissioner to do some of that conditional medical release for folks and look at each person individually. The other important thing that needs to happen that hasn't is that we need a public health expert to do some modeling in, first Moose Lake, where we have confirmed cases, but in all of our facilities, to determine what is the ideal configuration and the ideal number of people who are in there. And that's what happened in Ramsey County. The public health officials from Ramsey County recommended that reducing the jail population to a number that would allow for single bunking as opposed to double bunking was a target. And so we need to look first at how many people do we need to release, and then start looking at who can we release, who can be subject to home confinement, for example, or who could be released safely and who have the ability to social distance if they are released.
Okay, great. And building on this is another question that came in, and I feel like you hit it a little bit, but when you're talking about the different levels of people who could be released, so some of the minimum security, workhouse conditions, and this is a question that came in, so I'm going to read it because it sounds like it came in from a family member. Minimum security facilities are about 200 people in 200 men in a dormitory setting. They eat and sleep in the same room. They are not able to isolate. These inmates are wearing bracelets, work in the community in areas such as Plymouth, Edina, Eden Prairie, and Woodbury. They don't have fences around them. They've already served 2/3 of their time. Their MinStar score is very low. Are those people going to be released more quickly, considering they're already out there working in the community? And so do you feel like they'll be prioritized, or why, if you could talk a little bit more about, expand a little on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the sheriffs running those facilities aren't already talking about how to get these folks out, I think that they should be. Particularly because when you're in a dormitory setting, again, you cannot social distance. People are on top of one another, and they're not able to wear masks. And if they're coming out and working in the community, there is both a risk that they're going to come in contact with somebody and bring the virus into the facility, but there's also a risk that that somebody who has been infected with the virus inside the facility is going to transmit it to members of the community. And again, if people have served 75% of their time in the workhouse, that means they're going to get out anyway in the next few months, and they are not safer in that facility right now. The safer choice is to get them home.
Okay, great. Okay, so another question's coming in, and either Julia or Terry, either of you can answer this. What information is the government collecting on individuals to track the virus? The Star Tribune has an article this week, Terry, you were quoted in it, saying that police wanted to access the information about who has COVID. Is it specific to a first person? What are they trying to get? Is it broader mobility mapping through cell phone tracking? What are they interested in getting right now?
So I can start, and Julia, feel free to jump in. So my understanding is that the Department of Health does have details about the laboratory confirmed cases that they have, as well as cases that have been done by other health agencies. And what the police, the state police associations are asking for is for the address of every single person who has had a positive test. And they're seeking that because they want to protect first responders, and we're certainly mindful of that, and we want first responders to be healthy and safe as well. We don't think that this is an appropriate reaction, though. And again, remember I mentioned that all of the governor's actions, all of the government's actions need to be related to science and public health. And what we know is that there can be people who are asymptomatic who are still spreading the virus and are still a danger to the community. And there can be people who have symptoms but haven't been tested. And we know that there are serious there's serious undertesting. We know that the numbers that we have in Minnesota are much higher than what the laboratory confirmed cases are. And so by providing addresses of people who've had confirmed cases, all we're doing is giving police a false sense of security. And police should be treating every call, every interaction with the assumption that somebody might have the virus and act accordingly.
Okay, great. I'm gonna have one last question, and Terry or Julia, either of you can answer this one, and then after that we're going to turn it into some things you can do. A lot of people are wondering what they can do, and I'm going to turn it over to Jana right after this last question to talk a little bit about what you can do to both help get more people released. And we had one kind of final question about mail-in balloting. People had asked about the ACLU's position about mail-in balloting, and a lot of people have concerns and want to make sure that as everyone who wants to can vote by mail, so we don't have to ask voters to risk their health to vote. And so I'm going to leave it open for a second to see if Julia wanted to add anything about a legislative fix for this. But I would say one thing about activism you can always do without relying on the legislature is reach out to the Secretary of State. Since we do have a system of no excuse absentee balloting that's already exists, even if the legislature does not pass anything, we can be in communication with the Secretary of State, and all of us can reach out to make sure that Secretary Simon does everything in his power to ramp up absentee voting and making sure every single county has the sufficient resources that they need in case every single person chooses to vote absentee. Julia, did you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add maybe is that I don't think we've gone so far as my understanding is to say that we should only vote by mail. I think there's a general, understanding that there may be still, there's still circumstances in which people should be able to have access to an in-person polling place. So I think that's the only sort of like nuance maybe to the position around mail-in absentee balloting.
And someone just had an initial question, and Julie, you can either stay on for a second or this, and then we'll turn it over to you, John, is that according to Secretary of State Simon, no excuse absentee balloting will not be sufficient. I know that the Secretary of State has introduced additional legislation to try and expand access to that, correct, Julia?
It hasn't been introduced.
Oh, it's not been introduced, okay. Or was considering it then maybe.
Yeah, it was one of these bills that, as I mentioned earlier, got a sort of like informal hearing, but because they are mostly adjourned, hasn't had a chance to be introduced. So they sort of just had a chance to sort of at least hear about it. I'm assuming that's the sort of the proposal that's being questioned here. It was just in the last week.
Yes, it sounds like that. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to John to close us out and give us some action. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you for everyone who sent in questions.
Thanks very much, Jana, Terry, and Julia. Really good job, very informative. I hope everybody else got as much out of that as I did, because you guys did a wonderful job focusing on the high points and letting people know that, in fact, we are hard at work here at the ACLU of Minnesota. I strongly want to urge people to look at the COVID section of our website, ACLU-MN.org, because that has got updates and resources that are available to people, and it has got the opportunity to support us by taking a variety of actions. There's a COVID-19 response and resources section that I really would love it if people would get on there and see what you can do. For example, the question that just arose about mail-in balloting. The Secretary of State, we are hopeful, is being energetic and creative in this, but he absolutely needs to know that people are interested in this issue and supporting him on it. Also, everybody on this call has got a senator. Everybody on this call has got a representative. Those folks need to hear from you. Go on your on the legislative website if you don't know who it is, but get in touch with those folks. They are watching how people are communicating with them and advocating with them on making balloting available to everybody is enormously important. We do not want to see a repeat of the catastrophe that they had in our neighboring state of Wisconsin earlier this week, where people were put to the choice of exercising their right to vote or protecting their health. We can't have that happen here in the state of Minnesota. So be sure that you're registered to vote. Make sure that your census form is filled out. Let your elected officials know you are watching them. And we urge you to send messages of support to everybody who's keeping this community going. I started out this evening by talking about connections, and there are so many people who are working so hard, in many cases putting their lives at risk to keep us connected and to keep us safe. And so I urge you to act on your own, but please act together with us, with the ACLU as an institution. Institutions exist to allow us to band together in support of larger purposes. They permit a continuity that is otherwise impossible to achieve, and they allow a magnification of individual efforts. We at the ACLU have been fighting for our democratic institutions for the last 100 years, and with your help and with your participation, we will be here for the next 100 years too. So thank you all very much for participating Be safe. And good night. Thank you.